The theater hummed with a fading echo of applause, a lingering murmur of voices as the audience filed out, leaving behind a cavernous hush. On stage, a single spotlight still burned, casting its glow on the heavy crimson curtains that concealed the set. The backstage corridor was alive with footsteps and laughter, actors and stagehands unwinding after the night's performance. But inside the leading actress's dressing room, silence reigned. A silence so absolute, so unnatural, that when the dresser knocked and received no reply, a cold dread tightened in her chest. It was the assistant stage manager who first opened the door. What he saw sent him reeling back into the hallway, his breath strangled by shock. Margot Ashley, the illustrious star of the West End, lay slumped over her dressing table. The mirror before her reflected a pale, lifeless face framed by a cascade of golden curls. Her head rested against one arm, as though she had simply dozed off. A script was still clasped in her other hand. The room smelled faintly of perfume and powder, and a cup of tea sat untouched beside her. By the time the police arrived, the news had already spread through the theatre like wildfire. Inspector Craddock of Scotland Yard surveyed the room, his keen eyes sweeping over every detail. There was no sign of forced entry, no immediate evidence of struggle. The door had been locked from the inside, the key resting neatly on the table beside the cup. The only disturbance was the script. Margot clutched her own lines for the next act, printed in bold type. The final words circled in ink. Curtain falls. Darkness. A doctor pronounced her dead, the cause appearing natural at first glance. But something about the scene unsettled Craddock. It was too neat, too staged. He turned to the theatre's producer, who stood wringing his hands. Was she ill? Not that I knew of, the man stammered. She was magnificent tonight, not a single missed cue. And this script? Craddock gestured toward the circled line. The producer swallowed. That wasn't there before. The inspector's frown deepened. The tea, the script, the locked door, it all pointed to a carefully orchestrated performance. Poison was the obvious suspicion, yet the lack of any sign of struggle was peculiar. If she had been poisoned, had she drunk the tea willingly, or had the killer counted on something subtler? As the investigation began, whispers rippled through the cast and crew. Margot had her share of admirers and enemies alike. There was Anthony Drake, her leading man, who had once been her lover and now played the role of a spurned suitor both on and off the stage. There was her understudy, Vivien Leigh, young and hungry for the limelight, with a motive as old as theatre itself. The director, Henry Mallory, had been seen arguing with her earlier that evening, their words heated, though their subject remained unknown. The dressing room yielded little. No fingerprints beyond Margot's own, no sign of a break-in. The tea was sent for testing, but no immediate traces of poison were found. The locked door suggested suicide, yet there was no note, no indication of distress. The script seemed deliberate, a message meant to be found. When Miss Marple arrived at the theatre the next morning, it was under the invitation of her nephew, Inspector Craddock, a retired actress herself in her youth. She carried with her a deep appreciation for the world behind the curtains, the careful precision of a performance, the art of illusion. She moved quietly through the scene, taking in every detail with her sharp blue eyes. The untouched tea, the circled line in the script, the mirror before which Margot had slumped. She listened to the actors recount their final moments with the deceased. The way she had laughed, how she had stepped into her role that night with effortless grace. The show must go on, she murmured thoughtfully, tracing a finger along the edge of the dressing table. Craddock watched her, knowing better than to interrupt when she was thinking. At last, she turned to him with a small, satisfied nod. It was not poison in the tea, she said, but rather something in the air. The inspector blinked. The air? She gestured toward the mirror, then the table where Margot's makeup. Saturday. Theatrical tricks, my dear. Think of all the illusions a stage magician might use. Gaslight can dim at the flick of a switch. A scent can linger in the air long enough to take effect without a victim ever realizing. The question is not what she drank, but what she breathed. The actors exchanged uneasy glances. Vivienne's voice wavered. "You think someone poisoned her makeup?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It would be an excellent method, would it not? Something absorbed through the skin, or perhaps inhaled as she sat before the mirror, powdering her nose. And, of course, the final touch, a line circled in her own script, meant to look as though she had foreseen her own demise. But she did not mark that script herself." Craddock frowned. "Then who did?" Miss Marple turned her gaze toward the cast, her expression deceptively gentle. "Why, someone who wanted us to believe in a tragic accident, or a suicide, but they were rather too theatrical in their execution." Her eyes settled on one figure in particular, whose face had gone pale beneath the grease paint. A single bead of sweat trickled down his temple. "The show, after all, must go on," she said softly. "And for some, the role of a lifetime is worth any price." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Anthony Drake, the leading man, whose usual charm had given way to an uneasy stiffness. His hands were clasped behind his back, his posture rigid. A silence stretched between them, the air thick with something unspoken. When he finally exhaled, it was as if he had been holding his breath for too long. "Is that what you think?" he said. His voice measured, though his fingers twitched at his side. "That someone tampered with her makeup? It sounds rather fantastic, even for the theater." Miss Marple gave a small, knowing smile. "Oh, but the theater is built on illusion, is it not? Every detail carefully placed, every performance crafted to deceive. And yet, the most skilled illusionists often forget one thing." His lips parted slightly, but he said nothing. She gestured to the dressing table. "Reality leaves behind details that cannot be staged." Craddock, watching the exchange closely, cleared his throat. "Let's assume for a moment that Miss Marple is right, that Margot was poisoned through something she inhaled or applied to her skin. It means the killer had to have access to her dressing room, to her personal things. Who might that be?" Vivienne, the understudy, hesitated before answering. "Well, anyone, really. Margot wasn't the sort to lock her dressing room unless she was inside. We all passed through these corridors. The stagehands, the costumers. If someone had the right moment, it wouldn't be difficult." Henry Mallory, the director, folded his arms. "That's absurd. Do you know how many people work behind the scenes? If you're suggesting this was premeditated, that someone prepared her powder or perfume in advance, then you're looking at days of opportunity, not just a single moment." Miss Marple nodded. "Which is why the timing is crucial. If she had applied her makeup earlier, before the performance, the effects would have shown before the curtain call. But she was perfectly fine throughout the play." Craddock caught on quickly. "So whatever killed her had to have been introduced after the performance." Miss Marple's eyes flickered toward the dressing table again. "I wonder, did anyone see her freshen up before leaving the stage? Reapply powder or perfume?" Silence fell over the group, each face searching their memory. Vivienne's brows furrowed. She was always meticulous about her appearance. I think she touched up her face before coming out for curtain call." Miss Marple's fingers tapped lightly on the edge of the table, and yet she didn't collapse on stage in the glare of the footlights. She made it back here, locked the door, and only then did the poison take full effect. Craddock turned toward the dresser. "Was anything removed from this room before we arrived?" The young woman shook her head. "No, sir. Everything's just as it was." But Miss Marple's eyes told a different story. She stepped lightly toward the mirror, her fingers tracing its polished edge. Something was missing. Not an object, but a feeling, an impression of familiarity. She had known many actresses in her time, seen countless dressing rooms, each one cluttered with personal little touches, charms, handkerchiefs, brushes lined in neat disorder. This space was too pristine, as though something had been wiped away. She turned, her gaze settling on a small glass bottle near the powder box. "This perfume," she mused, lifting it delicately. Did Margot use it often? Vivienne glanced at it, her expression uncertain. "That isn't hers." Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Craddock. He stepped forward, carefully taking the bottle from her hands. "Not hers?" he repeated. "Then whose?" The air in the room thickened, the unspoken implications pressing in on the gathered faces. Vivienne looked at Anthony, then Mallory. She had her own signature scent, French, expensive. "That one isn't. I don't recognize it." The director's frown deepened. "Are you certain?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "A woman knows these things." Craddock called for the bottle to be taken for testing. As he handed it off, Miss Marple's gaze returned to Anthony Drake. The unease had not left his face. He was too still, too measured, as though weighing every word before speaking. "It must have been left there by accident," he said at last. Miss Marple gave him a kindly look, but her words were firm. "Or it was left behind because someone assumed no one would notice." His jaw tightened. "I had nothing to do with this." "Oh, I never said you did, dear boy. But someone very much wanted to tell a story with Margot's death. They staged it carefully, locking the door, arranging the scene so that it appeared tragic yet uncertain. Yet, for all their planning, they left something that didn't belong." She gestured toward the perfume bottle. "And that, I think, is where we shall find our first real deception." Craddock held the perfume bottle carefully, his brow furrowed in thought. The weight of it in his hand felt oddly significant, as if it carried the shape of an unseen truth. He turned it over, examining the label, no brand name, no markings of origin, a simple glass vial, elegant but unassuming. Miss Marple watched with quiet satisfaction, her sharp gaze flickering between the gathered faces. Someone in this room had brought it here, expecting it to go unnoticed. Anthony Drake exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "This is ridiculous. You're making something out of nothing." Miss Marple merely smiled. "Ah, but the smallest things are often the most telling. A misplaced item, a careless detail. Those are what truly unravel a mystery." Craddock straightened. "Right. Let's go through this properly. Everyone claims Margot seemed well during the performance, so we can assume the poison was introduced afterward. And if it was in something she applied, that means whoever left this bottle behind knew she would use it." His eyes swept the room, landing on Vivienne Leigh. The understudy had remained silent for the past few minutes, her fingers twisting nervously at the hem of her sleeve. "When did you last see Margot?" Craddock asked. Vivienne hesitated. "Right before curtain call. She was touching up her makeup, like he said. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but probing. "And was she alone?" Vivienne's lips parted slightly. I don't know. I think so. I was backstage, waiting for my cue." Craddock narrowed his eyes. "You think so?" The young woman swallowed, glancing around as though searching for a lifeline. "Well, I mean, there were people coming and going all evening. I wasn't watching her every second." Miss Marple tilted her head. "But you were aware of her movements." Vivienne hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Yes." Craddock made a note, his attention shifting to Henry Mallory. "And you, Mr. Mallory, you were seen arguing with Margot earlier." The director stiffened. "That was nothing. A disagreement over blocking nothing serious." Craddock's expression remained unreadable. Yet it was heated enough to be noticed. Mallory sighed. Margot was difficult, talented, but strong-willed. She had her own ideas about how things should be done. We clashed, but it was never personal. Miss Marple's voice was mild. "She had no concerns about her safety?" Mallory scoffed. "Margot was fearless. She never worried about anything." A small, thoughtful silence stretched between them. Craddock turned back to Anthony Drake. "Where were you after the performance?" Anthony's posture remained stiff. "I went to my dressing room." "Alone?" A pause. "Yes." Miss Marple's eyes glimmered with quiet interest. "And yet," she murmured, "you seemed quite startled when we mentioned the perfume." Anthony's jaw tensed. "Because this entire conversation is absurd." Craddock watched him for a long moment, then looked to the dresser, who had been standing near the doorway, silent and pale. "You were the first to find her?" The young woman nodded. "Yes, sir." "Tell me exactly what you saw." She swallowed. "The door was locked, so I knocked. When she didn't answer, I called for the stage manager. He got the key, and when we opened the door, she was just sitting there, like she'd fallen asleep." Miss Marple spoke gently. "Did anything seem out of place?" The dresser hesitated. "No. I mean, not really. Just the way she was sitting. It didn't look right." Craddock frowned. "How do you mean?" The young woman's hands twisted together, like she had been posed. "I don't know. I can't explain it." Miss Marple gave a small nod, as if this confirmed something she already suspected. "People rarely fall in such an elegant way, do they?" The room fell into silence. Craddock's mind was turning over each piece, each contradiction. A bottle of perfume that didn't belong. A script with an ominous line circled after the fact. A dressing room, locked from the inside, yet strangely untouched. And now, the possibility that Margot had not simply slumped forward naturally, but had been arranged to be found. Someone in this theater had gone to great lengths to shape a story around Margot Ashley's death. But like all performances, the truth lay in the details, and Miss Marple had already begun to see the strings behind the illusion. Craddock leaned against the dressing table, his fingers tapping idly against the wood. "So far, we have a locked room, a mysterious bottle of perfume, and a woman who was, by all accounts, perfectly fine until moments before she died. And yet, nothing adds up." His gaze flicked from one face to another. Everyone here had access to Margot. Everyone had a reason to want something from her. But who had a reason to want her dead? Miss Marple sat quietly in one of the chairs, hands folded in her lap, her expression thoughtful. "The trouble with motives," she said gently, "is that they are rarely straightforward. A quarrel, a broken heart, a secret fear sometimes. These things are more dangerous than greed or ambition." Anthony scoffed. "If we start going down that road, then we'll never find an answer. Actors argue, directors have their tempers, understudies feel overlooked. It's all part of the business." Miss Marple smiled slightly. "And yet, not every play ends in murder." Craddock turned his attention back to Vivienne. "You said Margot was touching up her makeup before the curtain call. Was she with anyone at that time?" Vivienne hesitated. "Not that I saw. But you weren't watching her every second." A flicker of something passed across her face. "No." Miss Marple studied her carefully. "You admired Margot, didn't you?" Vivienne exhaled slowly, folding her arms across her chest. "Yes, I did. And yet, being an understudy can be difficult, especially when the lead actress is so well-loved." Vivienne's jaw tightened. "I never wished her harm." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "But you might have wished her out of the way." Vivienne's head jerked up. "That's not—" She stopped, taking a breath. "That's not fair." Craddock watched her closely. "You knew you'd never get to take her place unless something happened to her." Vivienne's lips pressed into a thin line. "I wanted a chance, yes, but I wasn't the only one. Margot made enemies." Miss Marple nodded. She was a woman of strong passions, and strong passions in others can turn dangerous. Henry Mallory shifted uncomfortably. "You're wasting time with this. If you're looking for grudges, you'll find plenty, but that doesn't mean any of us killed her." Craddock tilted his head. "You argued with her the night she died." Mallory sighed. "She was threatening to leave the production. I tried to talk her out of it." Miss Marple's brows lifted. Leave? He hesitated. She wasn't happy, said she was tired of the stage. She had other prospects. Prospects, Craddock repeated. Mallory gave a small, humorless chuckle. She was planning to leave the theatre. For good. She had been offered a film contract. A murmur rippled through the group. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with interest. And did this contract offer extend to anyone else? Mallory's expression darkened. No, it was just her. Craddock exhaled. So, if she left, the production would be in trouble. The production? Mallory scoffed. The theatre itself would be in trouble. Investors, backers. Margot was the reason people were coming. Without her, this play would collapse. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. That does change things, doesn't it? Vivienne spoke quietly. She didn't tell me. Mallory's mouth twisted. She didn't tell anyone. I only found out because she was making arrangements. Miss Marple tapped her fingers against the armrest. And yet, she never left, which means something, or someone, stopped her. Craddock straightened. If Margot had plans to leave, then whoever killed her wasn't just acting out of spite. They were protecting something. A heavy silence fell. Miss Marple turned her gaze to Anthony. And you, dear boy, did you know she was leaving? His face hardened. No. Craddock folded his arms. You were her leading man. You would have been left behind. Anthony clenched his jaw. I wouldn't have cared. Miss Marple smiled kindly. Oh, I do think you would have. You see, the stage is a peculiar world. When two actors share the spotlight for long enough, their fates become intertwined. If Margot was moving on, she was not just leaving the play, she was leaving you behind, wasn't she? Anthony's lips parted, but no words came. A muscle flickered in his cheek. Craddock watched him closely. Were you in love with her? Anthony exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his hair. What does that matter? Miss Marple's voice was gentle. It matters because love, like ambition, can turn bitter when it is not returned. Anthony's fists clenched at his sides. I didn't kill her. Craddock let the silence stretch before shifting his attention. And what about you, Mr. Mallory? If Margot left, you lost everything. The production would collapse. The investors would pull out. Mallory's expression darkened. And you think I'd kill her over that? Miss Marple tilted her head. People have done far worse for far less. Mallory let out a short, bitter laugh. If I wanted to stop her from leaving, I would have convinced her. I don't need to resort to poison. Craddock watched him carefully. Perhaps you needed to make sure she never left at all. Another silence fell. Miss Marple smoothed her skirt, her eyes sharp despite her mild expression. We have a woman planning to leave, a man who loved her, a director who depended on her, and an understudy who might have benefited from her absence. And yet, none of these motives quite fit. Margot's death was too carefully staged, too theatrical. Which makes me wonder, was this truly about her at all? Or was she simply playing the final role in someone else's story? Craddock straightened as one of his constables entered the dressing room, a folded piece of paper in hand. Sir, we've just received something rather interesting. He passed the note to Craddock, who unfolded it carefully. Miss Marple watched his expression shift from curiosity to something more unreadable. He turned the note toward her. Margot knew. She found out, and she was going to tell. That's why she had to die. A murmur ran through the gathered company. Craddock's eyes swept over them, searching for any flicker of recognition, any sign of guilt. Found anonymously in the lobby, the constable added. Miss Marple's voice was soft. How very theatrical. A confession. Yet no name. Just enough to make us think we've reached the end. Anthony let out a sharp breath. Isn't that enough? Someone admits Margot was silenced. That proves she was murdered. Craddock nodded slowly. It does, but it doesn't tell us who. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the note. No, but it does tell us something about why. Henry Mallory shook his head. This could be from anyone. Some melodramatic nonsense left by an overexcited stagehand. It proves nothing. Craddock's brow furrowed. Unless Margot really did know something. Something worth killing her over. The room fell silent. Then, from the doorway, another constable entered, carrying a small velvet pouch. "Sir, we found this in Anthony Drake's dressing room." All eyes turned to Anthony as Craddock took the pouch, loosening the drawstrings. From inside, he withdrew a tiny vial, an exact match to the bottle of perfume found in Margot's room. Only this one, still, contained liquid. That's the same bottle. Anthony's face darkened. "I've never seen that before." Craddock turned the vial over in his hand. "Odd, isn't it? 2 bottles of the same unknown fragrance. One in Margot's dressing room, the other hidden in yours." Anthony took a step back. "I didn't put it there." Mallory scoffed. "Oh, come now. You were closer to Margot than anyone." Craddock's voice was measured. "Perhaps too close." Anthony's jaw clenched. "You think I poisoned her?" Craddock's silence was answer enough. Miss Marple, however, was watching him with an unusual expression, neither suspicion nor certainty, but something gentler. "No, I don't believe you did," she said quietly. Craddock frowned. "You don't?" She shook her head. "No. This is too convenient. It feels less like an answer and more like a performance." Vivienne's voice was barely above a whisper. "But who would go to such lengths?" Miss Marple's fingers traced the armrest of her chair. "Someone clever. Someone who knew the investigation would reach this very moment." Craddock exhaled. "You mean someone planted it?" Miss Marple inclined her head, and did so with great care. The first bottle left where it would be found, ensuring we questioned its significance. The second, deliberately hidden, only to be discovered at the right time. She turned her gaze to Anthony. "Tell me, dear boy, was your dressing room unlocked?" Anthony hesitated, then nodded. "I never lock it." Miss Marple's smile was small but knowing. "Then anyone could have placed it there, couldn't they?" Craddock rubbed his temple. "So we have false evidence leading us straight to the wrong man." Miss Marple nodded. "Precisely. And that means the real culprit is still among us." Mallory ran a hand down his face. "Then who?" Miss Marple's eyes glimmered. "Ah, that is the question, isn't it? And one I believe we are meant to answer incorrectly." Craddock straightened. "If someone wants us looking the wrong way, that means they're not done yet." A hush fell over the room. The sense of unease deepened, as if an unseen presence still lingered in the theater's shadows. And somewhere within that silence, the real murderer was waiting, watching, knowing that the final act had yet to begin. The dressing room remained eerily silent, the small vial resting in Craddock's hand like a loaded gun. Anthony Drake stood rigid, his face pale but set with defiance, while the others shifted uneasily. Miss Marple tapped a finger lightly against the arm of her chair, lost in thought. "Someone wants us to believe Anthony is guilty," she murmured. "But why? Because it's convenient? Or because there's something else we've missed?" Craddock exhaled. "We're going in circles. If Margot knew something dangerous enough to get her killed, we need to find out what it was. That note, whoever wrote it, had information." Vivienne hesitated. What if it was Margot herself? A pause. Miss Marple's head tilted slightly. "Go on, dear." Vivienne glanced at Anthony, then back at Craddock. Margot had been acting strange these past few weeks. She was distracted, nervous. It wasn't just about leaving the play. Something was bothering her, something she wouldn't talk about. Craddock frowned. "And you think she wrote this note herself?" Vivienne shook her head. "Not exactly, but what if she told someone something and they tried to warn us?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with interest. That would suggest Margot's knowledge wasn't just dangerous to her but to someone else as well. Anthony's voice was sharp. Then we need to figure out what she knew. Mallory exhaled heavily. And how do you propose we do that? Margot isn't here to tell us. Miss Marple turned her gaze toward the cluttered dressing table. But perhaps she left us something. Craddock followed her eyes. We searched her room already. Miss Marple rose from her chair, moving with quiet purpose toward the table. Even the best searches can overlook small things. And often, it is the smallest things that matter most. She ran a gloved hand over Margot's scattered belongings. Makeup brushes, a compact, a scattering of jewelry. Then, near the edge, something caught her attention, a small stack of letters, tied with a ribbon. She picked them up, flipping through them carefully. At first glance, they appeared ordinary. Letters from admirers, friends. But one envelope stood out. Unlike the others, its paper was old, slightly yellowed, the handwriting different from the rest. She unfolded it carefully and began to read. Craddock watched her expression shift, her brows knitting together. "What is it?" She handed it to him. "Margot, I don't know if you remember me, but I have never forgotten you. There are things you need to know, things I should have told you long ago. What happened wasn't an accident, it was never an accident. And now, after all these years, I fear the truth may finally catch up to us. Please, I must speak with you. There isn't much time." It was unsigned. Craddock let out a slow breath. "What wasn't an accident?" Miss Marple's expression was distant, thoughtful. "That is precisely what we must discover." Anthony took the letter, his eyes scanning it quickly. "This paper is old. Whoever wrote this is about something that happened long before Margot's death." Vivienne's voice was hesitant. "But what? What could be so important after all these years?" Mallory's jaw was tight. Margot didn't have a past like that. She was an actress, nothing more. Miss Marple glanced at him. "Everyone has a past, Mr. Mallory, even actresses." Craddock turned the letter over in his hands. If this was so important, why didn't she come to us? Why didn't she tell anyone? Miss Marple's voice was quiet. Perhaps she intended to. Perhaps she was waiting for the right moment. Anthony's expression darkened. And perhaps someone didn't want her to have that moment at all. A shiver passed through the room. Craddock squared his shoulders. "We need to know where this letter came from, who sent it, and what they meant." Miss Marple nodded. "And for that, we must look not just at Margot's final days but at the past she tried to leave behind." Craddock folded the letter carefully and placed it in his coat pocket. Miss Marple had remained silent for a few moments, her eyes focused on the room as though she were waiting for something to shift. "Margot was trying to leave something behind," Craddock said quietly, mostly to himself. "But what?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Sometimes it's not what someone leaves behind, but what they try to take with them." "What do you mean?" She nodded toward the dressing table, where Margot's belongings were still scattered. "Perhaps it isn't about the letter at all. Maybe it's about what she thought was safer left behind." Craddock's brow furrowed. What was it she wanted to forget? "That," Miss Marple said, "is what we need to find out." Vivienne moved to the window, her back turned. "Is this really about Margot's past?" Craddock caught her eyes in the reflection. "What do you know about her past, Vivienne?" Her shoulders tensed, and she shook her head. "I don't know anything." She kept her history to herself. I respected that. "Did you, or did you just not ask?" She shot him a quick, sharp glance. "I didn't ask because it didn't matter. She was a star. We all have our demons. But if you're asking whether she hid something from all of us, then yes, she did." Miss Marple's eyes glimmered. "There's a story there, isn't there?" Vivienne sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Perhaps, but I don't know what it is. All I know is that Margot kept to herself, especially when it came to her past." Craddock stepped closer to the window. "A star with a secret, so many of them are." There was a long pause before Miss Marple spoke again. But not all secrets are created equal. Some secrets are dangerous, and some are deadly. She turned toward the door. There is something we haven't tried yet. Craddock raised an eyebrow. What's that? A test of character, she replied. He eyed her curiously. A test? You mean, what? Miss Marple smiled. I suggest we give our suspects a little nudge, nothing too obvious, but enough to see how they respond. I'm not sure I follow. She gave him a look, one of those quiet, knowing glances she was so good at. The answer might lie in their reactions, not just their words. Craddock hesitated. Are you suggesting we push them into a confession? She shook her head. Not a confession. A crack in their armor, a subtle shift. Everyone is hiding something. But some people hide things in such a way that even the slightest provocation can make them slip. Craddock was quiet for a moment, then nodded. All right. What do you have in mind? Miss Marple looked back at the group, still gathered in the room. She smiled gently, almost as if she were amused by the drama unfolding before her eyes. Let's test their loyalty, she said quietly. Craddock blinked. Their loyalty? She nodded. To each other. A shiver of understanding passed over him. You want to see how they respond if they think one of them might be exposed? Precisely, Miss Marple said. Because loyalty can reveal things that fear cannot. Craddock's eyes lit with realization. You're going to plant doubt. Make them think someone might be about to turn on them. Miss Marple's smile widened. Exactly. Craddock took a deep breath and looked at the suspects. He could see the unease in their faces, the thin veneer of civility barely concealing the tension that ran through the group. This would work, or so he hoped. He turned to Vivienne. Vivienne, I need you to step out of the room for a moment. Her eyes widened. Why? Craddock gave her a steady look. It's part of the test. She hesitated but finally nodded and walked out. The door clicked behind her. Craddock cleared his throat. Now, we're going to have a little conversation. Nothing accusatory, nothing too forceful, but we're going to see how our suspects react when they believe one of them might be under suspicion. Mallory shifted in his seat. What is this nonsense? It's simple, really, Craddock said. We're just going to see how everyone behaves when they think the net is closing in. And maybe, just maybe, someone will give something away. Miss Marple stepped forward. We'll begin with something subtle, she addressed Anthony. Tell me, Mr. Drake, were you ever in contact with anyone outside the theater about Margot's departure? I know the press was interested, but did you have any personal dealings with anyone about her future plans? Anthony's eyes flicked to Mallory and then to Miss Marple. I know, no one outside the theater. Miss Marple's smile was calm but not reassuring. No business contacts? No personal friends you may have discussed the matter with? He stiffened. No, Miss Marple, no one. Mallory shifted uncomfortably. You're making a spectacle of this. We're all aware of the stakes. We don't need to go poking into things like that. Miss Marple's gaze turned to him. You're worried, Mr. Mallory. He straightened, then forced a laugh. No, I'm not worried. Just tired of this interrogation. But there was something in his eyes, something that flickered just for a second. A flash of fear. A crack in his calm facade. Craddock saw it too, and as Mallory grew agitated, a small, imperceptible weight seemed to shift in the room. It was there for just an instant. Mallory's calm turned to unease as he searched their faces for something. But when Craddock's gaze held steady, Mallory's shoulders dropped. A subtle but telling sign. Miss Marple looked at Craddock with satisfaction. There. That's the clue we needed. Mallory had reacted as though his world had tilted. And it was all because of a question about loyalty. His discomfort wasn't just about the investigation, it was about a hidden connection he feared might be exposed. The tension in the room was palpable as Craddock and Miss Marple exchanged a quiet glance. Mallory's reaction had been telling. But it wasn't enough to act on just yet. They needed more, something more concrete, to tie him to Margot's past. something that would connect the puzzle pieces that seemed to constantly shift. Craddock's mind raced with possibilities, and Miss Marple's gaze remained steady, almost contemplative, as she observed him. She had seen more than most could in a fleeting glance, and she was patient enough to wait for the right moment to strike. "What's next?" Mallory asked, his voice slightly strained, though he still tried to maintain his composure. "I believe we've made significant progress," Miss Marple said, her voice calm. "But we need to be cautious. Someone here doesn't want the truth to come out." Craddock was already halfway to the door. "I'll take another look around, make sure nothing's been tampered with. If someone's trying to bury the evidence, they might have made a mistake." Miss Marple nodded. "Trust your instincts, Craddock. They're rarely wrong." The room felt tight, suffocating, as Craddock stepped out into the hallway, his eyes scanning the space around him. He made his way toward the evidence room, where the file on Margot's death had been stored. The clues, the letter, even the vial, all of it was here. He paused at the door and checked the lock. It was secure. But as he turned the handle and stepped inside, the familiar scent of musty paper and dust hit him, along with a feeling of wrongness. The filing cabinets were in disarray. Some of the documents were scattered on the floor, and the vial, the crucial piece of evidence he had thought safe, was nowhere to be found. His stomach dropped. Craddock scanned the room. Everything else seemed untouched, but that vial, the one he had found in Margot's dressing room, was gone. It had been a small thing, but it was significant. It had linked her death to something far darker than the surface implied. And now it was gone. He stepped quickly to the nearest desk and rifled through the papers. There was no sign of the vial's contents, nothing to indicate that anyone had been here in a rush. It was as if the evidence had vanished without a trace. He moved toward the cabinets, and then he heard it, a quiet scuffing sound from behind him. He turned just in time to see a shadow slip past the doorframe. "Who's there?" Craddock called. No response. He moved swiftly, his hand on his revolver as he opened the door to the hallway. The corridor was empty, the flickering light above casting long shadows on the walls. Craddock's heart pounded in his chest. The momentary panic subsided, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. Someone had been in here. Someone was trying to make sure the truth never came to light. He stepped back into the room and surveyed it again. The evidence was missing, and no one else had been around to explain it. It had to be someone in the building, someone with access to the file. Miss Marple's words echoed in his mind. "Trust your instincts." Craddock knew that this wasn't a coincidence. The sudden disappearance of the vial, the disarray in the room, it was all part of something much bigger. Someone was working against him, trying to bury the truth. He left the room and quickly retraced his steps back to the others. As he entered the main room, the tension seemed to have thickened further. Mallory sat at the desk, his eyes narrowed, while Vivienne fidgeted nervously, clearly on edge. "Craddock?" Mallory asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "What's going on? What have you found?" Craddock stood still, his face hardening as he met Mallory's gaze. "Something's wrong. The vial is gone. Someone's been tampering with the evidence." Vivienne's eyes widened. "What do you mean? How could it be gone?" Craddock looked at her sharply. "The same way Margot's letter ended up in her dressing room. Someone's trying to keep us from seeing the truth." Miss Marple spoke then, her voice soft, yet piercing. "It's happening, Craddock. Someone is erasing the past, but they're leaving us hints along the way." Craddock turned to her. "You think this is deliberate?" "Oh, yes," she said, her gaze unwavering. "Every action has a purpose. Someone doesn't want the truth to come out, but they're making mistakes. Small ones. The kind we can use." "Then we have to act fast," Craddock said, his tone firm. "Whoever's doing this isn't going to stop until they've buried everything, and we can't let that happen." The air in the room felt heavy, as though a decision had been made, and now they were all part of something much larger than they'd ever anticipated. Someone was playing a dangerous game, and it was clear that they were no longer just hiding behind a mask, they were trying to destroy the truth. Mallory's voice broke the tension. "What's our next move?" Craddock thought for a moment. "We need to go back. All of us. Look at every connection, every word. Someone here has the answers. And we're going to make them give it up." Miss Marple's smile was faint but resolute. "And this time, we won't stop until we find the one thing they can't hide. The truth." Craddock nodded. He knew they were on the right path now. But the feeling of unease had only grown stronger. Someone was working against them. Someone who had more to lose than anyone else. And until he figured out who and why, the case would remain just out of reach, slipping further into shadows, just like the vanishing evidence. The silence in the room hung heavily as Craddock, Miss Marple, and the others exchanged looks, each one processing the implications of the stolen evidence. Time seemed to slow as the realization settled in. The case had just taken a darker turn. Someone, somewhere, was already anticipating their every move. Craddock felt the weight of the moment bearing down on him. The vial, the letter, it was all part of something far more intricate than he had imagined. He could sense the threads of a far-reaching conspiracy, and they were unraveling faster than he could catch them. But as his mind raced, a sudden sound broke through the tension, the sharp, unmistakable ring of a telephone. Craddock's heart skipped a beat, and he turned sharply to the source. It was the landline in the corner of the room. His eyes met Miss Marple's, and without a word, he moved swiftly to answer it. "Craddock," he said, his voice steady despite the growing unease. The voice on the other end was strained, breathless. "Detective Craddock, you need to come quickly. Something's happened." "What is it?" he asked, his pulse quickening. "There's been another incident. It's—" The line crackled, and then the voice went silent for a moment. "It's Vivienne. She's gone." The phone nearly slipped from Craddock's hand. "Gone," he repeated, his voice low. "She's missing, Craddock. No one's seen her for the last half hour. She was in the building, but now she's disappeared." A cold chill washed over him. It wasn't just that Vivienne was gone, it was the timing. The disappearance felt like a signal, a deliberate disruption, and Craddock knew they were on the verge of something much more dangerous. He slammed the phone down, his thoughts racing. "We need to move," he said, turning to Miss Marple. "Now." Miss Marple didn't hesitate. She stood quickly, a glint of understanding in her eyes. "We've been too focused on the past, Craddock. The present has just taken an unexpected turn." The urgency of the situation propelled them forward. Craddock gathered the others, and they rushed to the location where Vivienne had last been seen. As they moved through the darkened hallways of the theater, the heavy weight of foreboding hung over them. Craddock's mind raced. Who could have taken Vivienne? Why now, when they were on the cusp of discovering the truth? And why didn't the culprit strike directly at him, the detective in charge? The building was eerily quiet as they moved, the hum of the lights above the only sound. It was almost as though the entire theater had gone still, waiting for something. For the next act, they reached Vivienne's dressing room, and Craddock pushed the door open. The room was empty, save for a chair knocked over and a single red scarf that lay abandoned on the floor, its edges curling in a way that suggested it had been hurriedly discarded. Miss Marple knelt beside it. "A sign," she murmured softly, examining the fabric with a sharp eye. "Someone left this on purpose." Craddock moved past her and stepped into the room. His eyes darted across the space. There was nothing else out of the ordinary. But the sensation of wrongness only deepened. She wouldn't have left like this. Not without a word. "That's the point, isn't it?" Miss Marple said quietly. "Whoever took her wants us to know she's gone, but they also want us to ask the wrong questions." Craddock's pulse quickened. "You think they're sending a message?" She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "We've been chasing shadows, Craddock. Now the game has changed." As the realization hit, a sudden noise from outside the room made them both freeze. A door opening, footsteps echoing down the hall. Craddock's eyes snapped to the doorway, his hand instinctively reaching for his revolver. Before he could make a move, a shout rang out. "Craddock!" The voice was familiar Mallory's. Craddock rushed toward the sound, Miss Marple close behind. They turned the corner. And there, standing in the middle of the hall, was Mallory, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock. "She's gone," Mallory said again, his voice shaking. "Vivienne's been taken." Craddock's mind raced as he took in the sight of Mallory, who was visibly distraught. It didn't add up. Mallory had seemed so calm earlier, so poised, yet now he was on the verge of collapse. "I saw her leave," Mallory continued, his voice cracking, but there was something strange about it. She didn't walk out like someone who had decided to leave. She looked terrified. Craddock's instincts flared. Something wasn't right. Mallory's story didn't add up. Vivienne hadn't just vanished. Someone had made her disappear, and Mallory's reaction was just too perfect. Miss Marple was already taking in the scene. "Craddock, don't you see? The threads are all tangled. We've been chasing shadows, now we've got the real villain on the move." The feeling of urgency intensified. Craddock's mind raced through the possible scenarios. Vivienne wasn't just missing, she was the latest pawn in a game where nothing could be taken at face value. The fact that Mallory was the one to report her disappearance didn't sit well with him, especially given his reaction. The tension in the air was suffocating. Whoever was behind this had outsmarted them once again, and they weren't finished yet. Craddock turned back to Mallory, his eyes narrowing. "Where did you last see her?" Mallory's eyes darted nervously. I don't know. It happened so fast, Craddock." His voice was strained, like a man trying to keep a lie from slipping. "I only stepped away for a moment, and when I came back, she was gone. There was no sign of struggle, no noise. Just gone." Craddock knew it. There was something in Mallory's story that didn't make sense. Vivienne's disappearance had been planned, and Mallory had just revealed the first crack in the facade. And now, as the pieces started to fall into place, Craddock realized one thing for certain. Whoever was behind this was moving faster than they could keep up, and the game had just taken a deadly new turn. The minutes dragged on like hours as Craddock stood in the hallway, his eyes fixed on Mallory, who was still struggling to regain his composure. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp as ever, seemed to be quietly piecing things together in her mind. It was clear that she was already starting to see something the others hadn't. Craddock's thoughts spun in a dozen directions at once. Vivienne's disappearance, Mallory's suspicious behavior, the stolen evidence, it all pointed to something larger, something carefully orchestrated. But what? And why? He felt a growing frustration gnaw at him. It was as though they were standing on the edge of a cliff, with pieces of the puzzle just out of reach. But then, suddenly, a small detail broke through the fog of confusion, a pattern that had been there all along, unnoticed until now. Craddock's eyes narrowed, and he glanced at Miss Marple. She had a distant look on her face, as though she were deep in thought. He knew that look. She had figured something out, and it would only be a matter of time before it clicked into place. "Mallory," Craddock said, his voice low but sharp. "When was the last time you spoke to Vivienne before she disappeared?" Mallory blinked, looking lost for a moment before the question sank in. I don't know. It was earlier, before the show started. She was in the dressing room, getting ready, and I left for a moment to speak to some of the other cast members. And after that, I didn't see her again," Mallory said quickly, until I noticed she was missing." Craddock nodded, absorbing the information. The timing was all wrong. Mallory had been the last one to see Vivienne, and yet something about his reaction didn't sit right. There was a hesitation, a deliberate attempt to shift the focus away from his own involvement. But there was something else, something more subtle that stood out, something about Vivienne herself that Craddock hadn't fully understood until now. He turned to Miss Marple, his mind racing. "You said earlier that the clues were always in plain sight. What if the key to this whole thing was always staring us in the face?" Miss Marple's eyes met his, a spark of realization flickering. "You're right, Craddock. The smallest details have been leading us all along, but we've been too focused on the wrong things." Craddock's gaze flicked to the room behind them, where the detectives and police were still fumbling through the investigation, unaware that the true answer lay just beyond their reach. It wasn't the grand gestures, the dramatic reveals, or the obvious lies that had been misleading them. It was the quiet moments, the things that seemed insignificant, even trivial, that were the real key. Vivienne had been different in the days leading up to her disappearance. She had always been precise, almost obsessive in her routines. But something had shifted. Craddock recalled a conversation he'd overheard between two members of the cast, something about her unusual behavior before the show. They had mentioned how she had been acting strangely, how she had been muttering to herself in her dressing room, as if she were rehearsing something far more than her lines. The realization hit him like a slap to the face. It wasn't just about the performances, the career she had built. There was something deeper, something far more personal at play. He thought back to the small objects they had found earlier, Vivienne's scarf, the broken chair. It wasn't about a struggle, a kidnapping, or a chaotic escape. It was about control. Miss Marple stepped closer, her eyes scanning the room as though she were reading the very walls. "The pattern, Craddock," she murmured. "The pattern is in the habits. Vivienne's habits." Craddock felt the pieces finally start to fall into place. Vivienne had always been meticulous, always precise. She had been known to rehearse her lines to perfection, but now it seemed that the rehearsals were for something more than just a play. She was preparing for something bigger, something far more dangerous. He turned back to Mallory. Did she mention anything about feeling threatened? About someone else in the cast? Mallory hesitated again, and Craddock could see the sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. He wasn't answering the question. He was trying to figure out how to cover up his own involvement. The detective's mind raced. What if the answer wasn't about who wanted Vivienne dead, but about why she had felt compelled to disappear? Had she been running from someone she had known intimately, someone with a history tied to her past? Craddock's eyes widened as the thought struck him. The old case, the forgotten one. The details suddenly aligned in his mind like stars in a constellation. The pattern was clear. Vivienne had been drawn into something far darker than she had ever let on. It wasn't just a crime of passion or jealousy, it was something that tied back to an old, long-buried truth. And that truth was just waiting to be uncovered. He looked at Miss Marple, who gave him a quiet nod of approval. The key was in the past, something forgotten, something overlooked, but now it had re-emerged, demanding attention. "Mallory," Craddock said, his voice steady and cold now. "I think it's time you told us everything." Mallory's face went white. He had been playing his part too well for too long. The tension that had been building in Craddock finally snapped. The threads of the story, the motives, the deceptions, were all coming together now, and the one truth that had always been hidden in plain sight was now exposed. The key to solving the crime had been staring them in the face the entire time. It was not just the stolen evidence, or the stolen woman. It was the lies that had been whispered in corners, the silent threats, the things no one had dared speak of aloud. And now, as the pattern emerged, Craddock knew the real hunt was about to begin. The villain had not only outsmarted them, they had been playing this game for much longer than anyone had realized, and the final move was still to come. Craddock's gaze fixed on Mallory, whose face had gone pale, his every twitch betraying a growing sense of panic. The walls of the investigation, which had seemed so sturdy just hours before, now began to feel fragile, as though the whole structure could crumble with the wrong word. Yet Craddock's mind was racing, each thought a calculated step toward an inevitable conclusion. Behind him, Miss Marple stood still. her eyes sharp, as though she could sense the final unraveling of the mystery before anyone else could articulate it. Craddock could almost hear the whisper of an unseen thread being pulled tight. A long-forgotten case. The lies from Mallory. And, above all, Vivienne's final act of vanishing, her disappearance, wasn't just a desperate flight. It had been a deliberate choice. Mallory. Craddock began again, his voice firm but tinged with an edge of finality. Tell me about your history with Vivienne. What was your relationship really like? For a moment, Mallory seemed to recoil, as though the question had landed too close to something private, something that could no longer stay buried. His lips quivered, but no words came out. Craddock pressed on, his patience a thin veneer over the growing pressure. You knew her long before the theatre, didn't you? Before the stage lights and the applause. You were involved in something long before the drama started. Something you thought was over, but it wasn't. The detective's voice carried an undeniable force now, coaxing out the truth, or at least, the crack in the facade that had been carefully built. Mallory's eyes flickered to the ground. A long silence settled between them. Finally, with a voice barely above a whisper, Mallory spoke. It wasn't supposed to end like this. Craddock didn't let him finish. You didn't mean to kill her? You didn't mean to make it worse? The anger that had been building inside him now had a focus, aimed squarely at Mallory, but something told Craddock that the story wasn't as simple as a murderer's guilt. This was more than a crime of passion, it was something much darker, woven deep into the past. Miss Marple stepped forward, her presence commanding yet gentle, as she addressed Mallory with the same quiet precision she had used to dissect the case. Mr. Mallory, you and Vivienne were not just colleagues. You were more than that, weren't you? You were both involved in something that had consequences no one could predict. For a long moment, Mallory stood still, his face drained of color. Then, with a sharp breath, he finally spoke, though his voice was now hoarse. Vivienne and I, we were close, closer than people knew. Years ago, before either of us made it big, we had a secret, a mistake, a tragedy. He faltered, as if the weight of what he was about to reveal threatened to crush him. The tension in the room grew, as if the entire house were holding its breath. Vivienne, she was involved in something dangerous. A person we both wanted to forget. He was someone we thought we had buried in the past, someone who couldn't hurt us anymore. Craddock leaned forward. His mind was whirring, trying to make sense of the jumbled fragments of information. Who are you talking about? Henry Mallory, Mallory whispered, his face contorting in what could only be described as disgust. My brother. Miss Marple's eyes flickered with recognition, a thread she had suspected all along. She crossed the room slowly, her voice as steady as ever. Henry Mallory was your brother, but he wasn't a man to be forgotten, and his legacy still haunted both of you. Mallory nodded, tears beginning to well up in his eyes. Yes, he was dangerous, violent, he had his connections, and he used people. Vivienne and I both got involved with him, in ways we never should have. We thought we could escape, but we never did. Craddock felt the floor shift beneath him. The history between Vivienne and Mallory, her involvement with his brother, and the years of tension that had followed, created a web of motives far deeper than money or revenge. It was psychological, rooted in fear, and driven by something much darker than either Mallory or Vivienne had let anyone see. Miss Marple spoke softly, almost as though speaking to herself, piecing the story together. Vivienne had always been the performer, the one who could turn the most painful experiences into something people could admire. But in truth, she was running from the shadows of the past, trying to escape the memories of Henry and the terrible things he had made her do. Mallory swallowed hard, his hands shaking. Vivienne and I, we tried to get away. We thought we were free. But Henry, he was still out there. And when he found out what we were doing, when he found out Vivienne was becoming successful, he wanted her back. He wanted to control her again. I didn't know what to do. I thought, "You thought you could stop him?" Craddock interjected, the pieces of the puzzle snapping into place. "You thought that by getting rid of Vivienne, you'd rid yourself of your brother's hold over you, that you could erase the past, once and for all." No, no, it wasn't like that. I never wanted to hurt her. I loved her. But when she disappeared, when she left, it was like she was gone for good. And then, when she came back, when I realized she was still being hunted by Henry. He trailed off, as if the weight of his words had become too much. The detective and Miss Marple exchanged a look. The truth had finally emerged, and it was darker than either of them had expected. Vivienne's disappearance, the strange behavior, the stolen evidence. These were all symptoms of something far more twisted. A psychological battle between two people, both victims of the same twisted legacy. Craddock stepped closer to Mallory, his voice firm but measured. "It's over now. You can't run from it anymore." But Mallory's eyes were empty, hollow. I don't understand." "Henry, he's still out there. He always has been. And he'll never let us go." The room grew still, the air thick with the weight of Mallory's confession. The detective understood now. The real danger had never been about the crime. It had always been about the relentless fear that had driven Mallory and Vivienne to do the unthinkable. The tension in the room was palpable as Craddock stood, his back to the window, watching Mallory. The dimming light from outside cast long shadows across the room, making it feel smaller, more claustrophobic. Mallory's face, still pale with fear, seemed to shrink in the weight of the detective's steady gaze. Miss Marple remained beside him, her expression unchanged, a silent presence that seemed to absorb everything around her. "I don't understand," Mallory said, his voice cracking as his mind raced. "I thought I could stop this. I thought if I—" "You thought you could erase the past," Craddock interrupted, his voice unwavering. "You thought by hiding Vivienne, by disappearing her, you could end the cycle, but you've underestimated what's really at play here. Your brother isn't just an obstacle. He's the key, and now you've led us straight to him." Mallory looked away, his eyes darting nervously as if the walls themselves might betray him. You didn't know he was still watching, that he never really left?" Miss Marple's voice cut through the tension, her tone soft yet resolute. "You were always running from your brother, but in doing so, you've run straight into the trap he set. He's been pulling your strings this whole time, hasn't he?" Mallory's eyes snapped back to her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and horror. No, that can't be true. Henry can't be involved anymore." Craddock stepped closer, the quiet certainty in his demeanor like the closing of a trap. "We both know that's a lie, Mallory. Henry's hand is all over this Vivienne's disappearance, the stolen evidence, the threats that were made. Everything points back to him. But what I don't understand is why you kept playing the role of the victim. Why did you let us think you were part of the solution, when all along you were part of the problem?" For a long moment, Mallory seemed to deflate, as if the weight of the detective's words had drained the last of his defenses. He slumped against the wall, his hands trembling. "I never wanted this. I never wanted to hurt anyone. But Henry, he made me do things. He controlled everything. And I thought if I could get rid of Vivienne, I'd finally be free. But now—" His voice trailed off, his face a mask of regret. Craddock's mind was racing, fitting together the final pieces of the puzzle. He'd known something was off, something had never sat right with the way Mallory had behaved from the start. But it wasn't just fear. It was guilt, the kind of guilt that consumed a person and led them to justify unspeakable actions. "You've been running from your brother all your life, and now you're trying to run from the truth. But you can't, Mallory. We have everything we need to finish this." "And so do you," Craddock said, his voice quiet but commanding. As the detective spoke, Mallory's eyes darted again, and for a moment, Craddock saw the shadow of something else flicker in his gaze, a fleeting glint of something far darker than guilt. A shift. It wasn't fear. It was desperation. The detective's instincts flared instantly. "You're not the only one here who's been playing the game, are you?" Craddock's eyes narrowed. "You thought you had the upper hand, didn't you? You thought you could control the narrative, but you've been feeding us a false trail the entire time." Mallory's lips parted, but before he could respond, the door to the room suddenly slammed open with a force that sent everyone in the room jumping. A figure stood in the doorway, tall, broad-shouldered, with a look of sheer determination. Craddock's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the man. Henry Mallory, the man who had been hiding in plain sight, pulling the strings all along. He stood there, his eyes cold and calculating, scanning the room with the practiced poise of someone who'd been in control for far too long. And now, his game was coming to a head. "You're too late," Henry said, his voice low and smooth, a dangerous calm beneath the words. "You've been chasing ghosts, Craddock, all of you, and now you've walked straight into my trap." Craddock stood tall, unfazed by the sudden intrusion, his mind already working, analyzing the threat. He didn't move an inch, his posture composed. "The trap's already sprung, Henry. You're the one who's caught." Henry's lips twisted into a half smile, but it was a smile devoid of humor. "Do you really think you've won? You're so predictable, Craddock. Every step you've taken has led you straight into my hands. You think you've exposed me? You think I'll let you take me down that easily?" Craddock remained silent for a moment, his mind focusing. He knew now that the final piece was in place. Henry wasn't here to negotiate. He wasn't here for any more games. He was here to finish what he'd started, and he wasn't going to allow anyone to stop him. "I don't need you to confess, Henry," Craddock said, his voice hard, his eyes locked onto the villain's. "I just need you to make one wrong move." The atmosphere in the room seemed to freeze, every second stretching painfully long as the two men faced off, each one holding their ground. The silence was broken only by the faint, almost imperceptible shuffle of Mallory's foot against the floor. A sound that signaled the conflict was far from over. Henry stepped forward, his eyes narrowing with a flicker of menace. "You think you've got everything figured out?" He turned to Mallory. "Tell them, Jason. Tell them what you've done. Tell them how far you've gone to protect me. Tell them you've helped me every step of the way." Jason Mallory stood there, his body tense, his breathing shallow. The truth was hanging in the air, but the confession wasn't coming from him. Instead, it was Craddock's turn to make the final play. The detective stepped forward, his voice calm and cold. "I don't need his confession, Henry. I have enough. And you're right, there is something you didn't account for. You've underestimated one thing." Henry's brow furrowed as he stepped closer, narrowing the distance between them. "What's that?" "Me," Craddock replied with quiet finality. Without warning, the door behind Henry slammed shut with a loud bang, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps racing down the hall. The trap had been sprung, and Henry Mallory was already caught in his own web. Craddock felt the weight of the room shift in an instant. For a brief moment, he allowed himself a quiet sense of victory. Henry Mallory was in the net. His brother Jason had unwittingly revealed the depths of his involvement in the criminal web. All the threads that had seemed scattered now lay neatly in place, ready for the final unraveling. He turned to the officers who had come in behind Henry, ready to arrest him. But just as the handcuffs were about to snap onto Henry's wrists, a sudden voice pierced the stillness, chilling the air. It was a voice Craddock had barely expected to hear. "Wait." The word echoed through the room, sharp and commanding, like the clang of a bell tolling in the midst of calm. Miss Marple, who had been standing silently by the window, her arms crossed and her gaze fixed on the unfolding scene, turned slightly to look at Craddock. The detective froze mid-step. The feeling of dread that had risen in his chest was like a silent warning, an instinct that there was something more to this than just a final, neat resolution. Miss Marple? Craddock's voice was questioning but still steady. She didn't move, but the sharpness in her eyes was undeniable. "There is one thing you've overlooked, my dear Craddock," she said, her voice gentle but carrying a weight that forced everyone to listen. Craddock's mind raced, his body stiffening as the threads he thought were settled began to slip out of his grasp. "What are you saying?" Miss Marple slowly stepped forward, the quiet intensity of her presence amplifying as she took her place between the detective and Henry Mallory. She looked at Henry, then back at Craddock, her gaze calculating. "You see, dear boy, we've been so focused on the obvious suspects, the direct family connection, that we've missed something crucial. A hidden hand in all of this, someone who has been playing a far subtler game." Craddock's brow furrowed, confusion creeping in as the pieces of the puzzle, which had seemed to fit so perfectly, began to scatter in his mind. "What are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" She turned to face him fully, her eyes narrowing with the glint of sharp intellect. "The real mastermind, Craddock, is someone who has been in plain sight the entire time, someone whose motives were carefully buried beneath layers of pretense. In fact, I believe they've been working against both of you, using you as mere pawns to keep the focus off of themselves." The room fell silent. Craddock's heart skipped a beat, a chill creeping down his spine as the weight of her words began to sink in. Henry Mallory, who had been standing still in disbelief, stiffened. "Who are you talking about?" Craddock finally asked, his voice tight with suspicion. His eyes flicked toward the officers who had been watching with increasing uncertainty. Miss Marple's gaze never left him, but her words were directed to the room at large. "The one who has been feeding you both false information. The one who set this entire web into motion from the very beginning. The one who, if you had bothered to look beyond the surface, was hiding the most obvious connection to the crime." She let her words hang in the air, an invisible tension rising around them. For a brief moment, Craddock felt as though his world had tilted. His mind scrambled to make sense of it, trying to piece together the situation once again. "You're wrong," Henry sneered, a sneer that quickly shifted into a smirk of amusement. "No one's been pulling the strings except me. I'm the one who—" "No, Henry," Miss Marple interrupted, her tone quiet but sure. "You've always been too focused on the game, but someone else has been playing you. Think carefully, dear. Think about the person who had everything to gain from diverting attention away from themselves." The silence in the room grew heavy. Craddock's mind raced as the pieces finally began to click into place. There had been a missing element all along, someone who had appeared to be a mere spectator but had, in fact, been the one manipulating the entire situation. Someone with the perfect blend of access, motive, and opportunity. He didn't know why he hadn't seen it earlier. How had he been so blind? He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the faces around him, then landing on someone in particular, the last person he had expected. The last person who should have been connected to this case in any significant way. It was so obvious now, he couldn't believe he hadn't figured it out sooner. The officer standing in the corner of the room, the one who had been present at every major development in the investigation, shifted nervously as Craddock's eyes fell on him. The man, Officer Grant, was too calm for someone who had been involved in such a high-stakes case. His posture was too perfect, his eyes too careful in avoiding any scrutiny. Craddock's heart sank as he stepped closer. "Grant, it's you." The room seemed to freeze. Henry Mallory's face twisted in confusion and disbelief, as if he couldn't understand why Craddock had suddenly focused on the officer. "You can't be serious," Henry muttered. "Grant? He's one of us." Miss Marple's voice was steady, her eyes never leaving Officer Grant. "Not anymore, I'm afraid. It's all too clear now. Officer Grant was the one who played both sides of the investigation. He's been manipulating things from the inside, feeding false evidence, misleading you, and ensuring that Henry would remain at the center of your attention." Officer Grant didn't flinch. But the subtle change in his expression, the tightening of his jaw, the shift in his eyes was enough for Craddock to know that Miss Marple was right. "You were there at every key moment, officer." Craddock said, his voice now colder than ever. You gave the wrong leads. You made sure the right people were always in the wrong places. And when things looked like they were finally closing in on Henry, you pushed him further into the light. But now, the truth has caught up with you. The officer's composure cracked just for a second. His face went pale. But in that fleeting moment, the last semblance of his facade crumbled. His eyes darted to the door, but there was nowhere left to run. Why? Craddock asked, his voice low, dangerous. What was the real reason behind all this? Grant's shoulders sagged as the weight of his betrayal crushed him. I was just following orders, but I never expected it would go this far. I didn't want any of this. Henry knew how to get to me, how to make me believe I had no choice. He hesitated, the truth spilling out in a rush. He threatened my family. He promised I'd be protected. But all he wanted was control, and I let myself be controlled. Craddock's grip tightened as the final truth revealed itself. Grant had been just another pawn, caught in a web far more twisted than anyone had imagined. The case, it seemed, was still far from over. The detective's mind whirled, but this time he had the full picture. The tension in the room remained thick, every eye locked on Officer Grant, whose shoulders drooped under the weight of the truth. But the mystery wasn't over yet. Craddock felt the final pieces fall into place, but a nagging thought lingered in the back of his mind. Something wasn't quite right. Henry Mallory, still in his stunned silence, seemed to have lost all fight. His face drained of color. The officers held him firmly, but the real danger still loomed in the room. The remaining shroud of uncertainty, the lingering question of whether the case had truly been solved. Craddock turned to Miss Marple, seeking confirmation, but she had already begun walking toward the far side of the room. Her hands were folded neatly in front of her, her every step measured, deliberate, as though she were gathering her thoughts before making the final revelation. "Miss Marple?" Craddock called out, his voice thick with the weight of the moment. She paused and looked back at him with that steady, unfazed gaze. "I believe you're right, Craddock," she said softly. "But we mustn't forget justice is never as simple as catching the guilty party. Sometimes it's more about what happens after the truth is laid bare." Craddock took a step forward, confusion clouding his expression. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple looked down at her shoes, her mind no doubt retracing the many pieces of the puzzle they had uncovered. "You've caught Henry Mallory. Yes, the web of deception has unraveled before you, and you're standing on the cusp of victory. But remember, the deeper motives, the forces at play, sometimes they go far beyond one person." The detective frowned. "What are you suggesting? That Grant is just a pawn, and there's something more at play. If so, what was the point of all this?" Looked back up, her eyes sharp. "It's never just about one person, Craddock. In fact, the real criminal wasn't Henry, nor was it Grant. No, the true mastermind had been watching you all along. They've been leading you in circles, just as they led Grant." Before Craddock could respond, a faint sound from the hallway outside caught everyone's attention. The door creaked open slightly, and without warning, the detective's heart skipped a beat. Officer Grant's face paled even further, his mouth forming a silent, desperate plea. His eyes darted toward the door. The next moment, the officer bolted. "Damn it!" Craddock shouted, rushing forward in an attempt to stop him, but it was already too late. Officer Grant dashed into the hallway, his footsteps echoing down the corridor as he vanished around the corner. For a moment, everything in the room seemed suspended, as if time itself had paused. Craddock's instinct screamed at him to follow, but Miss Marple stood there calmly, as though she had expected it. "Don't chase him," she said softly, but firmly. The detective was torn between his duty to capture the criminal and the quiet certainty in Miss Marple's voice that had always guided him toward the truth. He took a deep breath, letting the silence in the room settle. "Why?" Craddock asked, his voice low, but tinged with frustration. "We can catch him. We're so close." Miss Marple's gaze remained unwavering. "Sometimes, catching the culprit is not the same as achieving justice. The real question, Craddock, is whether justice can ever truly be served when the guilty party has already escaped the law." Craddock's brow furrowed as he turned back to the officers, his mind still reeling. "You mean to say that Grant was only part of the story, that all of this was just a means to an end?" Miss Marple gave a slight nod. "It is always about the bigger picture. You see, the true villain wasn't in the room with us. They were never going to be caught. They knew the investigation would reach its peak, and once it did, the truth would be discarded. Too messy for the public to digest. They know how to manipulate the system." Craddock's mind raced as the pieces of the puzzle slowly clicked together. It wasn't about just stopping one crime, it was about controlling an entire sequence of events. The people who played the system, who used every tool available, knew exactly how to keep the spotlight off themselves. Henry Mallory, despite his crimes, had been a decoy. Officer Grant had been misled. And now, even as the detective had a suspect in hand, the truth had already begun to slip through his fingers. "I don't understand," Craddock muttered, the confusion finally breaking his composure. Miss Marple stepped closer, her voice quiet but incisive. "Henry Mallory's role was never to be the final villain. It was about creating chaos, keeping you distracted. It was never about money or revenge, it was about power. The people pulling the strings wanted to manipulate events to their advantage. Henry was just a means to an end." Craddock's chest tightened as the weight of it all sank in. So, who was the real mastermind? Miss Marple's lips twitched into the faintest of smiles. "It doesn't matter now. They'll disappear, of course. But you'll know, Craddock. You'll understand in time." It took a moment, but slowly, realization dawned on him. The signs had been there, buried in plain sight. The careful manipulation of facts, the subtle distractions he'd fallen into the trap of chasing the obvious leads. But now, it was clear. The true villains weren't the ones he'd caught, they were already long gone. Craddock's fists clenched at his sides. So, they've escaped. After all of this, they get away. Miss Marple's eyes softened, the sadness in them reflecting the bitter truth of the situation. Justice, sometimes, is an elusive thing. It's not about catching the criminal, it's about understanding the game they've played. And in this case, they've already won. The detective stood there for a moment, still processing the enormity of it all. The case was closed, but it felt unfinished in a way that made him question whether justice had truly been served. He'd done everything right, followed every clue, and yet the villain had slipped through his fingers like sand. But in the end, Miss Marple was right. The true nature of the crime wasn't in the capture, but in the understanding. He could see it now, the game that had been played, the web that had been spun, and the way it all unfolded around him. The truth had been there, hidden in the shadows, all along. As he watched the officers leave the room, their faces heavy with the weight of failure, Craddock knew that this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. The case was closed. The detectives filed out, the officers taking Henry Mallory with them, his expression blank, his future uncertain. The room, once buzzing with questions and tension, now felt hollow, as though the walls themselves were exhaling a long-held breath. Craddock stood alone for a moment, his mind still whirling with the revelations Miss Marple had shared. He hadn't caught the true mastermind, not in the way he had imagined, but Miss Marple had been right in a way he hadn't fully grasped at the time. Justice wasn't always about the tangible sometimes. It was about understanding the complexities that had led to the crime. The villains had played the long game, and in the end, they had slipped through his fingers. But that didn't mean Craddock was ready to give up. He walked slowly toward the exit, his shoes clicking against the cold floor, his mind piecing together the final fragments of the puzzle. Every case left its mark on him, but this one had been different. There had been something more insidious about it, something that didn't sit right. As he stepped outside into the brisk night air, the cool wind washed over him, a fleeting reminder of the world beyond the case. For a moment, he stood still, breathing in the sharpness of the evening, as if trying to clear his thoughts. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. And yet, even in the solitude of the night, something gnawed at him. Craddock reached into his coat pocket, his fingers brushing against the small, crumpled piece of paper he'd picked up earlier, the one with the cryptic message. At the time, it had seemed like an insignificant detail, just another scrap to set aside. But as he held it now, the weight of its mystery pressed down on him. The message read, "The game is never over." It had been scrawled hastily, the ink smeared as though written in a hurry. It hadn't made sense before, not when the case seemed to be closing in on Mallory. But now, as he stood there in the quiet street, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a random note, it was a warning, or perhaps a clue. Craddock's brow furrowed as he stared at the paper, the words sinking into him with increasing urgency. It had come from someone close, someone who knew the game was still in play. Was it a remnant of the past case? A final piece to a larger puzzle that he hadn't yet uncovered? His mind was racing now, and he couldn't ignore it. The thought lingered, slipping through the cracks of his logical mind. Could there be something else? A connection to another case he hadn't yet connected? Something far larger, more dangerous than the crime he had just solved? He turned on his heel, his pulse quickening as he felt the need to act. He couldn't let this slip away, not when it felt like the answers were just within his reach. Miss Marple's words echoed in his ears, the cryptic undertone of her final statement still fresh in his mind. The game's never over. Perhaps that was the truth he had missed all along, that a single case was never just that. It was always part of a greater game, a bigger picture that stretched far beyond the confines of a single investigation. The pieces might fit now, but what about the next time? What about the next puzzle that would inevitably rise, hidden in the shadows, waiting for him to find it? He glanced at the dark horizon before him, a cloud passing over the moon like a veil. Something stirred in him, a quiet, unrelenting pull-a-call to keep going, to stay ahead of the game, to follow the trail wherever it led. As he stood there, contemplating the mysteries yet to come, the sound of footsteps behind him caught his attention. Craddock spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for the pistol at his side. But the figure who emerged from the darkness wasn't a threat. No, it was a familiar face. Miss Marple. Her face was calm, unreadable as always, but there was a knowing gleam in her eyes. "Still thinking it over, Craddock?" she asked, her voice as soft as the night around them. He nodded slowly, still gripping the crumpled paper in his hand. "I don't know, Miss Marple. There's something here, a piece of the puzzle that I missed." She studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his thoughts. "You're not wrong. There's always more, Craddock. There are always layers beneath the surface, and the deeper you dig, the more you realize how much you don't know." His lips twitched at the edge of a smile. "Sounds like you've been in this game a lot longer than I have." Miss Marple returned the smile with a faint curve of her own. "I've learned that it's never the last case. It's always the next one that reveals the most." She turned to leave, her steps light as she disappeared into the night. Craddock watched her go, her words echoing in his mind. He had always known she was a step ahead of him. But now, for the first time, he wondered if she wasn't just ahead. Perhaps she was always playing a game that no one else could see, always looking ahead to the next challenge, the next mystery waiting to unfold. And as the wind picked up, swirling the crumpled note in his hand, Craddock realized something. Miss Marple was right. This case, like every other, would eventually fade into the past. But the game, the mystery, it would never end. Not for her, not for him. And certainly not for anyone who had ever walked the fine line between justice and the unknown. As he walked away, a new sense of determination filled him. The game had only just begun.